Chapter 1. The Manor of the Blackwood Crows, as it was morbidly known, was nothing but a mausoleum of forgotten splendor, a skeletal hand of masonry reaching toward a sky that was perpetually the color of old ash. This was Alistair Valerius's burden, the cold marble cage he had constructed for his endless penance. 2 centuries had he presided over this desolate fortress, his existence a long, self-inflicted wound. The great hall, where the first embers of an ancient fire had once warmed the ancilli of his bloodline, was now a cavern of shadow and dust, the moonlight that sliced through the Gothic arches serving only to highlight the tragedy of its decay. His marble skin was a poor shield against the pervasive cold, a cold that was not of the atmosphere, but of the soul. He remembered a time, a life, when he had felt the sun, when guilt was a simple, fleeting thing, not the omnipresent phantom that clung to his shoulders like a shroud woven from the deaths of his own coven. Now he was merely the vampire king, the last sentinel of a forgotten oath, his vast, terrifying power a silent promise of destruction should the ancient enemies or his own self-loathing demand it. His world was one of loneliness, a deep, chilling conviction that every choice he made was by its very nature a cosmic error. He moved through the silence of the manor with the liquid grace of a creature unburdened by human kinetics, but he was profoundly, irrevocably burdened. Tonight, however, the silence was fractured, not by a cry or a siege, but by something far more unsettling. The soft, rhythmic scratching of a pen on parchment, emanating from the single room he had dared to keep alive. The room of the girl. She was 17, all sharp edges and quiet shadows, with eyes that held the terrifying, clear conviction of a creature that knew its own true nature, but chose to hide it. Elara was her name, a name meaning sun, a cruel irony given the perpetual night of her existence here. She was the covenant, the prophecy, the anchor, the sole human female of a lineage believed to possess a soul capable of rebinding the fractured vows of the 9 bloodlines, a power Alistair had sworn, 2 years past, to protect until her 21st year. He had found her then, a frightened, traumatized child in the ashes of a burning village, already displaying the telltale signs of the sight. Visions that were not of the past, but of the dreadful futures he desperately fought to avert. He had brought her here, not as a prisoner, but as a ward, though the distinction was negligible. She lived within the orbit of his dangerous grace, guarded by his silent, fiercely protective rage. She was an object of duty, a living, ticking clock counting down to an apocalypse or a salvation. And yet, she had become his secret, solitary focal point. He watched her now from the threshold, a silhouette of impossible stillness. Elara sat at an antique, dust-mottled desk, bathed in the feeble, golden pool of candlelight, her face intent. Her hands, small and scarred from some forgotten childhood injury, gripped a pen, filling a worn, leather-bound book. Her diary. Alistair, despite his vast experience of warfare and the terrifying politics of the Undying, was momentarily thrown. He was accustomed to the language of blood, of steel, of ancient Latin curses and binding oaths whispered across centuries. But a diary? The soft vulnerability of it was a knife twist in his ancient heart. He could not, would not, cross the threshold to demand she cease. She was not a pet, nor a shield. She was choice itself, the living embodiment of the choice he had forever forfeited. He stepped fully into the room, the sound of his movement, if a vampire's motion could be called a sound, a mere displacement of the air. Elara did not startle. She never did. Her senses were preternaturally sharp, attuned to the subtle, deadly music of his presence. She simply set the pen down, marking the page with a thin ribbon. Her gaze, when it met his, was not fearful, but utterly frank. "It is late, my lord. she said, her voice a low, clear chime in the oppressive silence, formal as ever. The ritual of my rest is at hand. The formal address, my lord, was a constant reminder of the chasm between them, a distance he both desperately regretted and rigorously enforced for her protection. The shadow outside the window is thicker than usual, Alistair responded, his voice a baritone rasp, low and infused with an ancient weariness. It was an indirect answer, a subtle warning. He was speaking of the encroaching darkness, the umbra tenebris that was not merely night, but the physical manifestation of the enemies gathering at the edges of his domain. Do you see its shape? Alara possessed the prophetic sight. He needed her eyes to see beyond his physical defenses. She shifted, her shoulders straight, a posture of immense conviction masking a deep melancholy. I see only the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks, she replied, her eyes briefly scanning the window where moonlight and true darkness dueled. But I hear the remembrance louder tonight. It is calling to you, King of Ash. The remembrance. That was the word she used for his trauma, the collective echoing guilt of the centuries he had lived, the lives he had ended. He knew what she meant. The political shadows were long, and the ancient coven heads, even in their fragmented, scattered states, were beginning to sense the stirring of the anchor. They sought her either to destroy her or to control her immense world-bending power. He clenched a fist, the movement barely perceptible, his attention snagged by the leather-bound book beside her elbow. The book, Alistair said, his eyes, the color of polished obsidian, settling on the object with a terrible, consuming intensity. What are you inscribing within its pages, Alara? Are they the prophecies of my downfall, the secrets of the coven? His language was sparse, purposeful, designed to extract high-value information. He needed to know what she was documenting. Was it the truth of their terrifying arrangement? The details of the site? The book was a vulnerability, a single point of failure in the otherwise impenetrable fortress of his protection. He saw a flicker of something he did not recognize in her eyes, not fear, but a quiet, immense bravery, a silent challenge that spoke of a soul unwilling to be entirely possessed by a destiny, even one as grand and terrifying as hers. She reached out, her fingers brushing the worn leather, a gesture of profound intimacy. She was choosing to trust him or to defy him. With her, the difference was always terrifyingly thin. Chapter 2. Alara picked up the worn leather diary, its edges softened by use, and held it to her chest, a shield and a confession all at once. The air between them, already cold and thick with unsaid threats and unwanted dependency, seemed to freeze entirely. She could feel the liquid grace of Alistair's stillness, the terrifying patience of a creature that had survived empires. He was watching her with an intensity that went beyond his duty. It was something proprietary, something born of his own profound loneliness. The silence stretched, a high-stakes duel of wills. His question, "Are they the prophecies of my downfall?" had been formal and accusatory, but she had seen the raw, terrible flicker of genuine exhaustion in his eyes. He was not a king seeking a weakness. He was a man, or what passed for one, seeking a reprieve from his eternal, self-imposed burden. "No, my lord," she finally answered, her voice soft, yet possessed of an immense conviction. "They are not prophecies. They are merely remembrance." She repeated the word she had used for his own ancient guilt, deliberately turning it back on him, bridging the chasm of their status with a shared vocabulary of trauma. It is the only way to hold the past, the present, and the potential future in a single, comprehensible line. The site is chaotic, 1,000 broken mirrors reflecting possibilities. She gestured to the room, the heavy, dust-sheeted furniture, the pervasive cold. "But this place is quiet. My thoughts are still. In here, I write what is, what really happened." Her own words were a subtle shift in the narrative, a declaration of her own choice to define reality, even in the shadow of his immense, world-breaking power. She was not a passive recipient of fate. She was documenting it, making it real by the act of writing. The room, which he had deliberately kept alive for her, felt smaller now, warmer around the edges of the candlelight. Alistair remained utterly still, his dark cloak blending with the shadows of the room's corners, but his attention was absolute, pinned entirely on the small book. "Show me," he commanded, the words devoid of warmth, yet possessing an undeniable high-stakes vulnerability. He did not seek to read the entries of the site. Those were always abstract, terrifying images of fire, betrayal, and the splintering of covenants, things that made his marble beauty crack with unseen tension. He wanted to see what she had written about this reality, about the reality of his protection, about him. The request was the closest he had ever come to a plea for intimacy, a terrible demand for reassurance that his burden was not entirely pointless. It was the moment of vulnerability that the script profile had demanded, the guilt-burdened male seeking a confirmation of his inherent, powerful mercy. Elara understood the weight of the request. To show him the diary was to surrender the last piece of her sovereign self, to offer the deep emotional and mental insight into her world. She felt a profound tension in the atmosphere, the kind that preceded either a declaration of war or a declaration of trust. She opened the diary slowly, the pages rustling like dry leaves. She did not open it to a page detailing a siege or a betrayal. She chose a page near the end, one she had been filling tonight. She held it out to him, not standing, not moving, trusting his supernatural speed to claim the page without claiming her. "This," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is what really happened." Alistair crossed the room in a single, fluid motion that defied the laws of physics, a silent, predatory glide. He did not touch her, but his proximity was an overwhelming presence, the scent of cold marble, dust, and something ancient, something like the metallic, dark tang of blood and ozone. His unnaturally pale hand, the color of aged ivory, took the book. His eyes, the polished obsidian that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, scanned the elegant, small script. The light of the candle reflected off the slick black surface of his eyes, giving them an unnatural shine. He began to read, his formidable mind processing the unfamiliar language of human teenage introspection. The entry was simple, short, and devastatingly profound, lacking the poetic descriptions of the setting, yet possessing a sparse, impactful power. It detailed the event of a week prior, a minor incursion. A small, desperate group of renegade ghouls had managed to breach the outermost warding circles. The ghouls had sought the anchor for sustenance and power. Elara had been in the library. She had heard the primal, terrifying snarls. Alistair, realizing the wards were failing, had rushed her. The entry read, "He did not see me as the Covenant. He saw the child I was, momentarily. The terror must have been visible. He did not speak. He did not rage. He simply covered my body with his own, an impenetrable shield of marble and ancient armor. The creature's claws struck the stone of his back, and for a terrifying, singular second, I heard the sound of grinding bone. But he was still. His shield did not waver. When it was over, he stood, and the creature was dust, evaporated by a single casual backhand. He did not look at the ruin on the floor. He looked at me, his eyes dark with the blood scent of the attack, and said only, 'Do not fear the damage. Fear the choice to fail.' I remember the scent of the ash, the scent of his guilt. He chose to take the wound rather than see me frightened. It was not a king's mercy. It was a guardian's oath. I wrote that I did not fear the damage. I feared the possibility of disappointing him, of not being worth the immense 2-century-old burden he carries." Chapter 3. Alistair stopped reading, his gaze locked on the final stark sentence. I feared the possibility of disappointing him, of not being worth the immense 2-century-old burden he carries. The words were a quiet, immense declaration of trust and conviction, a terrifying mirror held up to his deepest, most fiercely guarded emotional wound. He, the King of Ash, who had committed atrocities in the name of a doomed covenant and endured 2 centuries of self-hatred, was now defined in this fragile human record not by his monstrous strength, but by his burden and his powerful mercy. The formal, concise language of the diary entry, sparse and purposeful, hit him with the force of an ancient spell. It cut through the intricate philosophical defenses he had constructed around his ancient heart, defenses designed to maintain the severe separation required by his duty. The King of Ash was accustomed to being feared, obeyed, and hated. He was not accustomed to being understood, let alone valued in such a quiet human way. His internal state, usually a deep, still ocean of melancholy and controlled rage, began to churn. The script-style profile demanded a shift into a close third-person perspective here, diving deep into the protagonist's emotional and mental insight. Guilt, he thought. It was the word she had attached to him, and it was true. The remembrance was loud, echoing the faces of the coven members he had sacrificed to ensure the continuation of the bloodlines, the terrible choices made in the smoke of the first cleansing. Yet Alara saw past the remembrance to the oath. She saw the protector. He felt a profound alien sensation, a flicker of quiet hope that was instantly tense and fiercely protective. He was not just guarding the anchor, he was guarding the only soul who had dared to document the truth of his intent rather than the legend of his actions. His eyes, the obsidian surface that usually betrayed nothing, began to glow, a faint internal luminescence, starting deep within the iris and quickly bleeding outward to fill the entire orb with a pulsing, terrifying red. It was the color of triggered immense power, the color of his true nature being brought to the surface by profound emotional conflict. He closed the diary with a soft, final thud that seemed deafening in the silence. He did not look at her, not yet. He looked at his own hand, the unnaturally pale marble skin that had signed 1,000 death warrants and sheltered her from a ghoul's claw. The red glow intensified. "I told you to fear the choice to fail," he said, his voice now deeper, rougher, the rasp of centuries. "You write that you fear to disappoint me. That is the same fear, only cloaked in a child's reverence." He finally looked up, fixing her with the terrible, glowing red of his activated power. "Do you think, Alara, that this covenant, this anchor you represent, is worth the sacrifice? Worth the lives that will be lost in the siege that will surely come for you? Worth the loss of my own remaining miserable pretense of a soul?" His philosophical dialogue was high value and sparse, cutting directly to the central conflict, mercy versus nature. Was his nature as a killer, an engine of war, worth the potential salvation she represented? Alara, despite the terrifying spectacle of his glowing eyes, a sight that had reduced hardened mercenaries to trembling masses, did not flinch. She maintained her posture of immense conviction. She had seen the sight, seen him in the depths of his rage, and understood that this red was not merely anger, but a profound internal stress born of his burden. She knew that to meet him now with fear was to fail his choice to protect her. "You are asking if I am worth your remembrance, my lord?" she countered, her language formal and precise, mirroring his. "You did not choose me. You chose the oath, the one that demands the continuation of the bloodlines, the one that seeks to rebind the fractured vows. I am only the vessel of that oath, the anchor." She stood up slowly, her movement deliberate, closing the remaining distance between them. She was small, human, fragile, yet she possessed the immense conviction of a soul rooted in a higher purpose. The contrast was stark, the inhuman stillness of the glowing vampire king and the quiet, purposeful motion of the prophetic female. "I write what really happened because you will not speak it," she confessed, her voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that sliced through the Gothic atmosphere. You choose to live in the Gothic fantasy of your self-hatred, but my duty, my lord, is to survive the character-driven political thriller. You fear failure. I fear that your loneliness will make you choose self-destruction before you choose salvation. You are an anchor to this world as much as I am, Alistair. You have simply forgotten how to float. It was a daring move, using his first name, a high-stakes vulnerability in their dialogue. She was declaring their interdependency, his role in the mystery reveal. Alistair's red eyes flickered, the immense power threatening to overwhelm his control. Her use of his name, the direct, unvarnished accusation of his deliberate loneliness, was a betrayal of the formal distance he needed to maintain. He felt a sudden, brutal wave of fiercely protective rage, not against her, but against the enemies that would dare to harm the only creature who could speak the truth of his purpose. The central conflict was raging inside him. Trust versus duty. He could crush her now, end the covenant, end the burden, and return to his self-imposed prison. But the entry in the diary, the remembrance of his powerful mercy, held his hand. He had sworn an oath. He had made a choice. Chapter 4. The red glow in Alistair's eyes reached a terrifying, incandescent peak before slowly, agonizingly receding. The internal struggle was visible on his face, the momentary distortion of his sculpted marble beauty, a conflict between his true nature as a killer and his oath as a protector. The sudden, brutal action was not physical. It was an internal siege, a moment of high-stakes escalation of his self-control. When the obsidian surface of his eyes finally returned, they were darker than before, reflecting the candlelight like polished pools of oil. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and the subtle, lingering scent of his immense contained power, began to thin. Her choice to use his name to force an intimate vulnerability had succeeded in deflecting the crisis of his self-hatred, replacing it with a fresh, targeted commitment to his duty. "You are impertinent," Alistair stated, his voice now calm, though laced with an undercurrent of metallic tension. He placed the diary back on the desk, precisely where she had left it. The high-stakes, dramatic, intimate tone was now fully present, fueled by the near betrayal of his emotional control. "You confuse my burden with my weakness, Ilara. My loneliness is not a mistake. It is a meticulously constructed shield, designed to keep the world from knowing the precise measure of my despair, which would tempt them to strike where my control is weakest." He moved closer, leaning slightly over the desk, his massive frame dwarfing her small one, but his movement was slow, deliberate, respecting the boundaries she had established with her courage. "You write what really happened in a human tongue. Do you ever write the truth of the sight?" His question returned to the high-value information he needed, the prophecy, the world-changing information. Ilara met his gaze without wavering. She recognized the change in his demeanor. The king had reasserted control, but the man had been irrevocably exposed. "I do not write the sight," she confessed, her voice maintaining the formal register despite the intimacy of their discussion. "The power is too wild. The visions of ancient enemies and the splintering of the covenant cannot be contained by ink. They exist in a language older than the vampires, Ethereum, the tongue of the primal vows. I simply use the diary to record the consequences of the visions, the moments where your actions intersect with my prophecy, so that I can provide the narrative for the political thriller that surrounds us." She paused, deliberately adding another layer of deep emotional insight. "I write that you are fiercely protective. I write that your immense conviction is what keeps the skeletal branches outside from becoming the siege Yuang. Fear." Alistair looked down at the diary once more, his mind racing. Her words were a confirmation of the mystery reveal he sought. She was not merely seeing the future. She was filtering it through the lens of their unique, terrifying partnership, the poetic and highly descriptive language of her internal state, which he had only glimpsed, was a key to surviving the high-stakes escalation that was coming. "There is a reason why the remembrance called to me louder tonight," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to her. I have received a coded missive, an artifact from the undying coven that survived the first cleansing. They have tracked my movements, they know the anchor lives, they demand her return, or they promise a siege that will make the last centuries look like a simple border skirmish. The transition to the external conflict was complete. The character-driven conflict arc was about to meet the high-stakes escalation. Alara nodded, her expression grim but resolute. I saw it, not the letter, but the blood on the parchment, the silent promise of betrayal. Her ability to see the future consequence of an event, even without seeing the event itself, was a constant, unsettling reminder of her power. They will arrive at the winter solstice, the night when the blood vows are at their weakest. They seek to use the power of the anchor, not to rebind the vows, but to fracture them entirely, making themselves masters of the new, fragmented covenant. Alistair finally stood fully upright, his silhouette a towering, dark presence against the pale wall. The time for introspection was over. The time for survival had begun. Then the deliberate rhythmic pacing must speed up, he said, his voice now purely the king, the commander. We must prepare for combat. I will reinforce the wards, but they will be breached. We must choose an anchor that is not tied to a fixed location. We must move. His plan was sparse and purposeful. Alara reached out, her hand resting momentarily on his arm, a gesture of physical contact that was both a declaration of trust and an intimate, high-stakes vulnerability. The proximity to his marble skin was electric, the cold emanating from him a stark contrast to the small warmth of her human touch. You cannot fight them alone, my lord, she whispered, her eyes holding his, a deep, melancholy, tense exchange. You are powerful, but they will come with the ancient knowledge of the bloodlines. You need a shield that does not require your constant attention. You need to become the king again, not merely the guardian. The suggestion hung in the air, a silent question. Would he use her power? Would he break the covenant of her independence for the sake of survival? Chapter 5. Alistair felt the feather-light pressure of Alara's hand on his arm, and it was a more profound shock than any siege weapon could inflict. It was the absolute, raw manifestation of the trust he had only dared to read about in her diary. The cold, marble beauty of his skin registered the heat of her human touch, a sensation both alien and terrifyingly grounding. The moment was a perfect example of the script profile's call for close-up focus on physical contact, hands, scars, wounds, highlighting the inhuman nature of the supernatural against the warm vulnerability of the human. He knew she was right. To fight the remnants of the undying coven, who were driven by ancient political ambition and a desire to seize her power, he could not afford the luxury of maintaining a loneliness that demanded his perpetual personal protection over her. He needed to activate the full world-breaking potential of the anchor. You are asking me to use you as a weapon, Alara, he stated, his voice low and dangerous, returning to the philosophical conflict of his nature. The oath demands your protection until the solstice, when your powers are meant to be unveiled. To expose them now is to ensure the complete destruction of my domain, and perhaps the ruin of your soul. The language was formal, yet intimate, revealing the depth of his internal conflict. He needed the power, but he refused the choice that would sacrifice her essence. That would be a true failure, a return to the moral decay of his past. My lord, the choice has already been made, she countered, her hand slipping away, the loss of contact a sudden, sharp coldness in the air. Her conviction was immense. The prophecy is not one of me simply surviving the solstice, but of acting upon it. The diary documents what really happened. Your mercy. I have seen the future where you refuse my aid. A skeletal manner, yes, but one covered in your own ash, the king having chosen self-destruction over the choice to live. That future must be averted. I am not asking you to use a weapon. I am asking you to accept an anchor. She paused, her eyes, usually shadowed by melancholy, now gleaming with a quiet, fierce resolve. My power is not only the sight, it is also the ability to amplify the existing covenants. I can make your blood a wall, your shadow a snare, and your voice a binding oath against the remnants of the coven. But you must ask, you must make the declaration of trust. Alistair looked at her, truly seeing the immense conviction beneath the trauma. She was defining the terms of their survival. This was the character-driven conflict arc reaching its zenith, the isolating, guilt-burdened male being forced to accept vulnerability and partnership by the prophetic, isolated female. He understood the sparse, purposeful action required. He reached out, not to touch her, but to the worn, leather-bound diary, lifting it again, this time with a deep reverence. He did not open it. He simply held the book of her inner life, of her truth, as if it were a talisman. Then we will not flee. We will stand upon the solstice, Alistair declared, his voice a low, commanding boom that resonated off the dust-mottled walls. The decision was final, an immediate commitment to high-stakes escalation. The deliberate, rhythmic pacing is broken. We shall meet them here, in this mausoleum. It will be the grand, final stage for the Gothic fantasy they so desperately want to destroy. He then performed the ultimate, intimate, high-stakes vulnerability. He gave her a direct order, free of his usual formal distance, rooted entirely in their shared purpose. Alara, the diary, I need you to inscribe one final, world-changing information into its pages. Write the complete, unvarnished truth of the site concerning the solstice. Write the Ethereum translation of the blood vows. Make the book a true anchor, a point of power that I can bind my ancient defenses to. You must turn the diary into a weapon, a final declaration of our intent. Alara's face softened for the first time, a small, genuine smile flickering across her lips, instantly chased away by the gravity of the moment. She understood. She was no longer just the protected covenant. She was a partner in the political thriller, a co-author of the narrative. The book of what really happened shall become the book of what must happen, she replied, taking the diary back, her hands steady. But know this, my lord, once the Ethereum is written, the book will cease to be merely a record. It will become a part of the vow itself. The choice will be irrevocable. Your burden will be bound to my destiny. Chapter 6. Alistair watched Alara return to the desk, her small figure illuminated by the solitary candlelight, now casting a long, unwavering shadow on the walls of the desolate manor. The light contrasted starkly with the pervasive shadow of the room, a perfect visual cue for the dramatic situation. She picked up the pen, not with the hesitant movements of a writer, but with the focused, ritualistic precision of an ancient priestess preparing a sacrifice. He knew the risk was immense. By demanding she inscribe the Ethereum, the ancient language of the primal vows, into the diary, he was transforming a book of simple human introspection into a potent, unstable anchor that could either save them or shatter their world entirely. The choice was irrevocable, a high-stakes, fundamental betrayal of his original oath of simple protection. But in the face of the coming siege, the supernatural romance of their quiet survival had to yield to the brutal reality of the dark academia, haha, character-driven political thriller. He turned away, moving toward the vast, empty expanse of the Great Hall, his ancient mind already spinning the complex mathematics of warding circles, the strategic deployment of the manor's surviving ancient defenses, and the allocation of his own immense, terrifying power. He had 2 weeks until the solstice, 2 weeks to turn a mausoleum into a weapon and an oath of protection into a declaration of war. His movements were now entirely sparse and purposeful, the liquid grace of his gait transformed into the focused, deadly stillness of a predator ready to spring. He needed to draw upon his own true nature, the millennia of knowledge and the raw, world-breaking power, while simultaneously managing the fragile, burgeoning trust he had placed in the human girl. As he reached the enormous vaulted archway of the great hall, the cold emanating from the stone seemed to recede, replaced by a feeling of purposeful tension. He could already feel the subtle stirring of the ancilli remnants of his coven, scattered across the continent, sensing the coming battle and the activation of the anchor. They would come, some to aid, most to betray. He was prepared for the latter. Betrayal was the currency of the undying. He was defined by his guilt. They were defined by their endless, self-serving ambition. "My lord," Alara's voice called out from the room, low but clear, carrying the absolute conviction that defined her. He paused, his shadow stretching across the length of the hall. He did not turn. His attention was total. "The Ethereum is inscribed. The blood vows are translated. The diary is no longer merely a remembrance. It is now the declaration." She had finished the transformation, sealing their fate. Alistair, still facing the endless, skeletal darkness of the hall, let out a deep breath he did not need, a purely dramatic gesture of acceptance. "Good," he said, his voice a baritone rasp that resonated with an ancient weariness now overlaid with fierce resolve. He knew he had to offer her a final, high-value reassurance, a quiet, immense statement that defined his new choice. "Then know this, Alara. When the siege breaks and the shadows come for the anchor, I will not be merely a shield. I will be the choice that brings them to their end. You wrote that I fear disappointing you. I will not. I swore an oath to your lineage, and I will be the anchor that keeps us both from the eternal cold." He was speaking the truth of his intent, the fiercely protective, driven core of his being. The central conflict was no longer internal, it was external, rooted in the political thriller. His long, sensory-rich sentence, describing the setting and his internal state, gave way to a short, impactful action line. He raised a hand, and with a silent, concentrated effort of will, the ancient, dormant wards embedded in the manor's foundations crackled to life. A pulse of visible, dark energy, infused with the scent of ozone and iron, expanded outward from the manor, creating a shimmering, almost invisible barrier against the encroaching umbra tenebris. The single candle in Alara's room suddenly seemed brighter, the sole focus of light and life in the dead, cold landscape. The first movements of the ancient, scattered coven members were already visible in the distant woods, tiny, fast-moving pinpricks of dark matter, drawn by the activation of the anchor. The siege had begun, even before the solstice. Alistair turned, his obsidian eyes fixing on the doorway of the room where Alara sat, the new, irrevocable declaration resting on her desk. His final action was the ultimate declaration of his trust and his acceptance of the new, terrifying intimacy of their partnership. "Rest now, Alara," he commanded, his voice still formal, but laced with an intimate, protective finality. "But know that the King of Ash has chosen his purpose. The choice is made. We will die beautifully, or we will live eternally. The narrative is now ours."